Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. If the long slog of war in Ukraine has no end in sight, what should the West's message on Ukraine be? Let's get to the bottom line. Wars don't end like in Hollywood movies. There's no magic moment when everyone just decides to lay down their arms, and there's no clean victory. Even when the warring parties sit down to negotiate, well, the fighting only gets worse because each side wants to improve their bargaining position. The West has so far spent more than $100 billion to support the Ukraine war effort, besides imposing crippling sanctions to kick Russia out of the global economy. But from a military standpoint, the war looks and feels more like a stalemate, with neither side able to achieve total outright victory. So is it time for the West to rethink the best options for the Ukraine-Russia war? And what would those options look like? Today, we're talking with former Senator and former Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel, who made history as the first enlisted combat veteran to serve in that position, and Edward Luce, the U.S. editor for the Financial Times and author of The Retreat of Western Liberalism. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me today. Ed, let me just start out with you for a moment. We were both at the Aspen Security Forum recently, and I was interested in the view that sort of permeated the crowd that there was somehow going to be a knockout blow or an effective counter offensive in this war, or something that would bring it to some sort of definitive tip, if you will, in the way this would go. And we heard over and over again how Russia had already lost this conflict. And I read your piece recently in the Financial Times saying there will be no Hollywood ending to this. Tell us what you think the gap is, if you agree with me, between what the strategic class is thinking about the Ukraine conflict and where you think the reality is.
I would, Steve, broadly agree with your summary of what happened in Aspen. Look, I think there is still an expectation, although a mounting frustration, that it hasn't happened yet, that this counteroffensive will deal a knockout blow. It'll regain a significant sort of share of the Donbass, possibly even Crimea, and that Putin's loss will be sealed by the end of this summer, by the end of the fall, before we move into another winter. But there is mounting frustration with the allegation that the Biden administration and its allies in Europe are not giving Ukraine the tools to finish that job. And I do think that that's a little bit simplistic. I think expectations there are a little bit high because Ukraine's being asked to attack. Its dramatic successes last year were in defense. It's much easier to defend than to attack, A, and B, Russia has put in fortifications and minefields 30 kilometers deep in some places across the lines in eastern and southern Ukraine that Ukraine's now trying to probe. It's an incredibly difficult task without having mass casualties to break through those. And so I think these expectations are a little bit hyped.
Secretary Hagel, I'm wondering, given your experience with war and conflict, how the Ukraine war is shaping up, and what are you worried about in the defining nature of this contest right now?
Thanks, Steve, and thanks to Ed. This is a war not just between Russia and Ukraine. This is a war about the future of a world order. The first time in 75 years since the post-World War II world order that we've seen anything like this occur. The Balkans was a different situation. But this now is a challenge to the world order. It isn't just defined and confined to Russia and Ukraine, as we know, with all the NATO countries involved, as much as a lot of people want to say and act like, well, we don't want to really start something. We don't want to go too far. But I think that's a mistake, because the only question we ask ourselves is, how does this end? Time is not on the side of the Ukrainians for obvious reasons. And I think now is the time for the United States, all our allies, to pour the kind of resources into this effort as more than just necessary. I think you look at the political strategic issues on the Russian side. I think Putin is weakened. I don't know how weakened he is, but I think he is weakened. And I think it may be deeper and wider than we know, what the press knows or anybody else. But this is going to be and continue to be a war of attrition with Putin. until something breaks here. Another aspect of this, Steve and Ed, is what happened here a couple of days ago when the Russians attacked a grain storage area right on the border of Romania. You've got things going on in Belarus. So this is not a time to quibble or wring your hands. Either you're in or you're not in. And the West has got to see it that way. And I'll just end with this. We've learned through history about what appeasement brings. And I think the President Biden, I think who's done a pretty good job managing all this the last 16 months, has got to go back to the Truman days and Eisenhower in 1956, when Eisenhower backed the French and the British out of Suez and said, no, we didn't fight World War II so you can reorganize your colonies. That's the kind of presidential courage that I think we're gonna have here. I recognize that the campaign is next year. If things really go wrong and bad on the Ukrainian side, Biden will be blamed for that. I know that, by the Republicans. All that is true, but this is really a defining time, I think, in our history, and I think in world history.
I'm just interested if you think the stakes that you just laid out very articulately require a different kind of posture from the U.S. and NATO allies.
I do, and I don't think it's a simple thing here that we've got. Well, we'll just kind of go along and give them enough and so on. No, that's not going to work. And I would be in favor of escalating this to the point that gets you to where you want to be to end this thing on your terms, on Ukraine's terms. But it's more than Ukraine. It's bigger than Ukraine. One point I would make here. It's interesting to me that Russia is the brutal invader of another country and says every time Ukraine hits Crimea or hits somewhere else, Russia says, oh, foul. You have to play by certain rules in warfare, Ukraine. We don't. I mean, we can hit your cathedrals. We can do all the damage to your civilians and all the atrocities that are going on. We don't have to follow rules, but you do. We've got to recognize that and be honest about that and say, no, war is war, Mr. Putin, and you are going to get the full force of the United States and our NATO allies because, again, this is about the future. And if the leaders of NATO and the West don't understand that, then I think we're going to be in a lot of trouble because you can't let him nibble away. Obviously, China's watching this. Everybody's watching this. And it will turn the world upside down if Putin gets away with this. And so that means we've got to accelerate, in my opinion. I mean, not blindly. Obviously, you got to be smart about it. But we're kind of in never land right now. And we've got to get out of it.
But I would be quite keen to know, Secretary Hagel, is when we're talking about escalation, NATO being full in, what, are we actually talking about a direct declaration of war on Russia? Because it's sort of almost sounded like that. And I don't think that's where the foreign policy community would be. So is your concern the nuclear dimensions of that conflict, or? Well, if the implication of what Secretary Hagel is saying is that we should enable Ukraine to retake Crimea, everything pre-2014, that is going to involve, yes, a massive escalation. I mean, a massive escalation.
President Zelensky believes that taking back Crimea is important. For those that are advocating immediate or near-term Ukrainian membership in NATO, it is designed that every square inch of Ukraine, as formally recognized, be defended by NATO. So by definition, the inclusion of Crimea is part of that. I can't imagine a carve-out being permitted by the leadership in Ukraine unless you know something I don't.
No, and Zelensky would jeopardize his political leadership of Ukraine if he forfeited the desire to regain Crimea as well as the other territories. But look, there are a couple of things here. One is this counteroffensive, we're in late July. At the same time last year, there was a lot of frustration with the lack of progress in Ukraine's first counteroffensive. That came, all the big gains, the regaining of Kharkiv and of Kherson, and the territories around it, occurred in September, late August, September, early October. So it might be that we're getting prematurely frustrated with this. My second point, though, is that Putin has basically lost in his key aims with this war. I don't agree that we're in a never-never land where Putin hasn't been defeated. I think that Putin's key war aims, which were to destroy Ukraine as a nation, to depose the Zelensky regime, to disunite the West, and to use energy as a leverage to disunite them further. On each one, he has singularly failed. So now that could be reversed. I believe if Donald Trump is re-elected as president, these gains could be, from the West's point of view and Ukraine's point of view, could be reversed. But right now, I don't think that Putin has done anything other than lost, and is in a terrible dilemma.
Chuck, my question to you is, what do you know about the stability and instability around Vladimir Putin that becomes a factor in this conflict?
Well, first, just briefly, let me respond to what Ed said. I'm not saying, Ed, let's declare World War III or declare war. No, that's not what I'm saying. There's something before that we can be doing that we're not doing. And as I've already noted, accelerated what we can do in the kinds of equipment and armaments that F-16s and so on that we're giving Ukraine. Because if we don't do this, this is going to go on, and Russia will be the winner. No matter what you say about Putin, and maybe he may not last internally, but yeah, he's not won. He's not taken Kyiv. He's not taken Russia. But they are in control, the Russians, of 20% of Ukraine. That's pretty significant. Now, to your question, Steve, I think there's a lot to this, as I've already said. As you both know, the intelligence, how strong is Putin? How much trouble internally is he in? I don't know. But what I do know is I think he is in some trouble. I think he's weakened. That's one reason why we need to accelerate now and do more now. I agree with Ed that there's maybe too much quick judgment about how slow things are going for the Ukrainians. It is easier to defend. I mean, with all the tank traps and the mines and so on and so on. So you got to be smart about that. But Ukrainians have got to have the equipment. They've got to have everything that they've got now and more. Because what I'm saying is this isn't going to last forever. Month after month after month, if this drags on, we've got a presidential election. There are other elections in Europe and NATO countries next year. NATO countries will start waffling. We've got some of that in this country. We've got members of Congress who are saying, well, we ought to stop now. We've given them enough, so what? That will occur the longer this goes. And that's my point here.
Let me ask you another question, Ed. I worry a little bit if you think about China being an extraordinary challenge, both opportunities to fix world problems, but also a competitive challenge in a lot of different ways. How in many ways the Ukraine conflict could potentially be a wonderful trap, both for Russia and the West, that basically diminishes resources, power, strength, while China just rises. Do I have it wrong?
Not necessarily. I mean, I think that the one impact that you can see from Putin's invasion of Ukraine on China is, when I say you can see, which I think we can surmise, we can guess, is that it's making the Chinese, Xi Jinping in particular, think twice about the costs of a full-blown amphibious assault on Taiwan. I mean, the surprising degree of Ukrainian defiance and effectiveness was just not something.
But what are the costs? I mean, Ed, let me just to be pushed back for a minute. Russia has not been pushed out of the international economy. There is a growing kind of anti-West. I mean, on another level, if you begin looking, take our Western hat off for a moment and ask to go to Chuck Hagel's point. If you look at the other dimensions of global power out there, Russia's not alienated all nations of them. I mean, it's not as isolated as we would like. It's been far more resilient in this conflict than I think we want to believe it to be. And so,
compared to where Russia was before this special military operation,
right,
it's in a very bad place.
Yeah.
So is Putin. Putin was master of all he surveyed in February 2022. Now his life expectancy, or his job expectancy at least, is very much in question. Bill Burns, the CIA director, said something memorable about the Prigozhin-Putin encounter. Putin, of course, called Prigozhin a traitor, which can mean only one thing in Russia. It means you're dead. 3 days later, he's meeting him for tea.
His caterer.
His caterer.
Yeah.
And so Bill Burns said something very memorable, which is either the emperor has no clothes, the emperor being Putin, or he's taking a very long time to get dressed. Putin is in a very precarious situation because of this war. Because there's now loyalty questions across the military, he's not in a position to promote competence over loyalty. He has to value loyalty above all else. So he can't get rid of Defense Minister Shoigu, who has failed. He can't get rid of Gerasimov, the leader of the war effort, who has failed. He has to prize loyalty because he's vulnerable, which means his ability to prosecute this war, it becomes less robust as his own position, as his own political power becomes more shaky. So I think the idea that Russia hasn't paid for this, and Putin in particular hasn't, and that the elites around him who can't get access to most of their wealth haven't paid, I think that's wrong. I'd push back very strongly on that.
Hey,
Chuck,
Steve.
yeah, go ahead.
The points that Ed made are exactly the reasons that I'm saying that now is the time for the West to accelerate, for exactly the reasons that Ed is talking about. And I agree with what Ed said. That makes sense to me for us to push it harder now and do more now, because I think Putin is in some trouble. And I don't think it gets better for Putin.
Well, let me ask you, Chuck. I spoke about a week ago with the senator from your state, Senator Deb Fischer, who is on the warpath, accusing the administration and the West of saying, you're not taking this war seriously, you're not taking American defense seriously, you're not producing the munitions both for what we need in this conflict and what we need for U.S. security. Jake Sullivan basically said this war is going to be fought and won not with F-16 and exotic weapon systems, but on 155 millimeter ammo shells, or 152, which are Russian made, which they can get because they can use either. And we can't keep Ukraine supplied. Now, and I look at it as a student of conflict and war. Ukraine is not the biggest conflict in the world can be imagined. How can we have so little ammo in the world to make a difference? Your thoughts?
Well, I would say that what Jake said and what Deb Fischer said, both of them are right, but you combine both of their points. This war is going to be won or lost on all those things, but the most important thing is the will of the Ukrainian people, which has been underplayed, undervalued, and understated, and a huge mistake that Putin made, as well as underestimating the strength of the West and NATO to come to their rescue, essentially, and help them. So it isn't just one or two of those things that Jake said or Deb Fischer said. It's all of those things together. Let me just one quick thing about air power. Air power is really important because it gives you an additional part of the threat that you bring to Russia. Air power does. And yeah, it can be confined and defined by how and where you want to use it. But boy, that would be critical. That'd be so critical for Ukraine. So I know I've heard the criticisms that Fischer and others have made, mainly Republicans, of the administration. I think, as I said earlier, I think generally the president and his team have done a pretty good job. But I think they got to do more. And I've said that all along. It's not the first time I've said it on this program.
Ed, let me just bring you just to wrap up the show here and get your final thoughts on things like air power. I mean, you seem to be convinced by Jake Sullivan, the president's national security advisor, sort of poo-pooing air power, poo-pooing the FC, saying, hey, yeah, we can get them and deploy them, but not that important. What's important are basically, reading and arithmetic, basically simple systems. And I sort of feel like there's an honest debate going on out there. Chuck Hagel is saying we should be overwhelming the Ukrainians with everything we possibly can do in this moment. And I did not hear that either from Tony Blinken or Jake Sullivan. But were you sold by Jake Sullivan about what he said?
just to be clear, I am not a military expert, but since there is differences of opinion amongst military experts, there is a debate. And what Jake Sullivan, so I did the fireside chat with him, as you know, said was, of course they need F-16s, and of course they need long-range artillery for their future security. He said, but in terms of the counteroffensive of the situation now, what they need is to get through mines. And because both the Russians and the Ukrainians have good air defense equipment, Patriot missiles, etc., this is not, at the moment, a battle in the skies. This is a battle on the ground. And therefore, our imperative is to get 1.5mm and whatever it is, shells. It's ammunition, it's shells, it's demining equipment, and it is, of course, very controversially, cluster bombs.
That'll be another show.
Yeah.
And Chuck, just real quick.
Steve, in my opinion, it's all those things.
Right.
It's all that you need.
So Chuck Hagel, in our last moments, what you've advocated for, honestly, is a different posture than what we're doing now with the Ukrainians. You're saying overwhelm. We're basically doing just in time and slightly above. I'm just interested, what do you know, what do you feel in your gut? Do you feel that America is going to shift the way you've recommended?
Do I think they're going to shift how?
Shift to overwhelm, to help provide the Ukrainians with all of the above, which you have said is so important right now.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's strong voices on both sides. And again, I go back to the election in 2024. That's the dark, heavy cloud that hangs over everything. And you guys know that. You know the politics of this, and especially the risk and the chances and what's at stake in the presidential race and the congressional races next year. So, the Biden administration, and I'm not saying that they're developing policy based on what's best for them politically, but that's a reality that I know they're looking at. You look at the Congress, I mean, we're paralyzed in this country. We can't govern in this country. We're politically divided. And so both parties use all issues, and this issue is going to be used. And I know it's a tough issue for the president, very tough. But that's why I say go back and read a little bit about Harry Truman and about Dwight Eisenhower and some tough decisions they made politically. But we're right for the interest, long-term interest of our country, peace in the world, and the world order.
Well, thank you to you both. Fantastic discussion. Former Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel and the U.S. editor of the Financial Times, Edward Luce, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
So what's the bottom line? Ukraine's leaders say they must win, or else they're going to lose their homeland. Russia's leaders say there's no way they're ever going to back down. The Western backers of Ukraine, well, they want to see a decisive knockout blow, and some even want to see the foundations of Putin's Kremlin come tumbling down. But there are no signs of any of that happening. What is likely is horrible, maybe even worse than what we've seen thus far. So now each side is testing the other side's spirit and resolve. The pain that the West feels, even though it's nothing like what Ukrainians are experiencing, is likely to go up. So what will happen to break that resolve? My gut tells me that rising populism in the U.S. during a presidential election is going to make the Ukraine conflict something to run against and not run for. That's the big challenge, and that's the bottom line.